Prologue. You are empty inside, girl. No wolf. No worth. No name worth carrying. That was the first thing they taught me about myself, and they taught it with their boots. I was 9 when the pack mothers dragged me out of the moon ceremony by my hair because I had not shifted, would not shift, could not. The other children burst into fur and joy under the silver light. I stood in the snow in my human skin and shook, and they pointed, and they laughed, and one of them spat on my bare feet and called me moonless. Empty. A husk that breathed. For 16 years after that, they made sure I never forgot it. I scrubbed their floors. I emptied their wounds of pus and their dead of blood. I slept on stone behind a healer's hut, and when warriors needed a body to mock between battles, I was the body, because a wolfless thing cannot bite back. So when I tell you I climbed onto that cold table and offered them my spine, do not imagine it was bravery. It was that I finally had something they wanted. The saw bit into the third bone of my back, and I tasted copper, and I did not scream because screaming was a thing they had already trained out of me. The pain went white. The pain went silent. And through it, beneath it, under everything, I felt the shattered blade on the table across the room turn toward me in the dark, turn the way a starving animal turns toward warmth, and a voice that was not a voice spoke into the hollow they were carving out of me. There you are, it said. I have been looking for you for a very long time. And I, who had been told my whole life that nothing lived inside me, understood in that instant that everyone had been lying. Hello, and welcome to the Moonlit Romance Collection. This is an original werewolf romance audiobook, written by Moonlit for your entertainment only. If a wolfless girl giving up her own spine for a king who doesn't even know her name already has your heart pounding, type empty and no more in the comments and let me know you're listening. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. 3 days before they cut her open, Tamsin Reeve was on her knees in the snow, scrubbing blood off the steps of Greyhold, when the vow shattered. She felt it before she heard it. A crack ran through the cold air, not a sound so much as a wound. Every wolf within the fortress walls flinched at once, 200 bodies jerking like a single struck nerve, and Tamsin, who had no wolf and never flinched at anything, dropped her brush and pressed both hands flat against the stone, because something deep in the marrow of her own back had just answered. She did not know what it meant. She only knew that for one breathless second, she had felt something that nobody had ever told her she was allowed to feel. Like a held note, like a thread pulled taut between her spine and the heart of the mountain. Then the screaming started up on the high battlement, and she got up and she ran because someone was always bleeding, and bleeding was the only thing the pack had ever needed her for. Garrick Greymore was on his knees when she reached the war hall, and the sight of it stopped her cold in the doorway. The Alpha King did not kneel. She had lived in his fortress for 16 years and had never once seen it. He was a mountain of a man, broad and dark and scarred, the kind of presence you felt against your skin before you ever saw him cross a room. He moved through the world like the world owed him space. And now he was down on the war hall flagstones with his great hands cupped around the shards of a broken blade, as though he could hold its pieces together by will alone.
The vow.
The Fang blade, the single weapon that, for 9 generations, had held the threshold sealed against the hollow. It lay in 7 pieces on the iron table, and even broken, it hurt to look at, pale, ancient metal that the old packs had pulled from the bones of the mountain before the wars, metal that carried a sliver of every Greymore king who had ever wielded it. When Garrick's hands closed over it, his amber eyes had gone glassy and wrong, and his beta, a thick-shouldered man named Halden, was gripping his shoulder and saying his name over and over like a man trying to wake a sleeper from a drowning dream. He's bonded to it, old Etta muttered beside Tamsin. The Boneright had appeared at her elbow the way she always did, soundless, one milk-white eye and one black. Every king is. The blade breaks, the bond breaks with it. Look at him. Half his spirit just went into those shards. She clicked her tongue. And in 11 nights, the moon goes dark, and the ward over the threshold goes with it. And then the hollow comes through, and there will be no fortress left to scrub. Tamsin barely heard the last part. She was watching the king, because as Halden hauled him upright, Garrick's head came up, and his ruined, glassy gaze swept across the hall, past the warriors, past the council, past everyone who mattered, and snagged, for one impossible instant, on the wolfless girl in the doorway with a bloody scrub brush at her feet. He frowned, as though at a sound he couldn't place. Then his eyes rolled back and he collapsed, and the hall erupted, and Tamsin pressed her aching back against the cold stone and thought, very quietly, that the thread she'd felt had just gone tight enough to cut. They argued about her bones in front of her as if she were already a corpse. It was the next morning, in Etta's smoke-dark hut, and Tamsin stood against the wall while the Bonewright laid out the truth to the three most powerful wolves in the pack. The king could not stand. He lay fevered on a cot, his spirit bleeding out into the broken blade, and his beta Halden spoke for him. "There is a way to reforge it," Etta said. "The old way. The only way. A blade like the vow can be made whole again, but not from metal. It needs living bone. Spine bone. Freely given, from someone whose marrow still rings." She turned her white eye on the room. Most living bone is silent, dead inside, even in the living. But once in a long age, a body is born whose marrow holds a song. Lay the vow's shards against that bone in the forge, and the blade drinks it, and the king's spirit anchors back into the metal. The ward holds. The hollow stays out. "And the giver?" Halden asked. Etta was quiet for a moment. "The giver is bonded to the blade after. They feel what the king feels through it. Pressure. Heat. Wound." She paused. "And spine bone, taken from the living, does not grow back. They give up part of themselves forever, and they limp the rest of their lives, if they keep their legs at all." "Then we find a warrior whose marrow rings," Halden said. "A volunteer with honor enough to. I've tested every wolf in this fortress." Etta's voice flattened. 200 warriors. 40 pups. Every body of standing in this pack. Silent, all of them. Not one of them rings. The hut went still. And then, slowly, the Bonewright turned her white eye toward the wall, toward the wolfless girl who scrubbed the steps, and Tamsin understood with a lurch of her stomach exactly why Etta had asked to test her 3 nights ago, and why the old woman's face had gone so strange afterward. "No," Tamsin said. "You felt it when the vow broke. It wasn't a question. Don't lie to me, child. You felt it in your back. I watched you." A woman swept forward from the doorway then, golden-haired, leather-clad, a wolf rippling visibly under her skin with every movement. Solveig of the Ashreach pack, daughter of Greymoor's strongest ally, who had been guest in this fortress for 6 weeks for the single, unspoken purpose of becoming its Luna. She looked at Tamsin the way one looks at a stain. "You cannot be serious," Solveig said. "A moonless scullion? You would put a husk's bones into the king's own blade? The vow carries the spirit of 9 kings. It would spit her out." "It rang for her," Etta said, "louder than it has rung for anything in 40 years. Solveig's beautiful face went tight, and Tamsin, pinned against the wall, heard her own pulse roaring in her ears, because every wolf in this room wanted something from her bones, and not one of them had ever once asked her name without spitting it. She thought of 16 years of stone floors. She thought of the boots. She thought of the spat-on feet. And she thought of the voice in the dark, the one thing in her whole empty life that had ever looked at her and said, "There you are." "What do I get?" Tamsin heard herself say, in a voice that did not shake. "If I let you cut 3 bones out of my spine to save a king who has never spoken to me?" The room turned to her, every face shocked that the husk had a mouth. It was Halden who answered, after a long beat. "Name it." She didn't know yet what she wanted. She only knew, looking at their stunned faces, that for the first time in her life, she was holding something they could not take by force. "I'll tell you," she said, "when I'm on the table. Now I have to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me, because we've all been there in our own way. If your whole life, everyone told you that you were nothing, and then one day the very people who mocked you came begging because you were the only one who could save them, would you help them? Or would you make them wait? Tell me in the comments. I really want to know what you would do." Chapter 2. She made them carry the king into the room while they cut her. That was her price. Not gold, not freedom, not even the limp that Etta promised her. She wanted Garrett Greymoor in the room, conscious, watching, when the wolfless girl he'd never spoken to gave up 3 pieces of her spine to put his shattered spirit back together. She wanted, just once, to be seen by the man whose floor she had scrubbed. She did not let herself examine why. So they laid him on a cot against the wall, half roused from his fever, propped so his ruined amber gaze could find her. And they laid Tamsin face down on Etta's cold stone table with a strip of boiled leather between her teeth, and they bare her back to the freezing air, and the old bonewright pressed a saw to the 3rd bone of her spine. "You can still refuse," Etta murmured low. "Only for her. Right up until I cut. After that, there is no going back. Some part of you stays in that blade forever, girl. You will feel his life inside you until the day you die." Tamsin's hands closed on the table edge. Across the room, through the smoke and the firelight, the king's eyes were on her, and they were clearer now than they had been since the vow broke, fixed on her face with a frown of confused, dawning attention, as though even half-drowned in fever, some animal part of him had finally noticed she existed. 16 years, she thought. "And it takes my spine to make you look at me." "Cut," she said around the leather. The saw bit in. The pane was a white room with no door, exactly as it had been in the dark of her prologue, and she went into it and through it and was inside it again, and she heard, felt, the bones separate with a wet, grinding pop that traveled up through her chest more than her ears. And as it came loose, the shattered vow on the table beside her flared, the broken shards lighting from within with a pale cold fire, and across the room the Alpha King arched up off his cot with a sound she had never heard a man make. Because he felt it too. The thread she'd sensed when the blade first broke snapped taut between them, bone to bone, spine to blade to king, and for one terrible suspended instant Tamsin Reeve and Garrett Greymore were the same animal screaming in 2 bodies. Then it passed. Etta lifted the small, blood-threaded vertebra free and dropped it, pulsing faintly, into a clay bowl. "1," she said. "2 more." Tamsin turned her head on the cold stone and met the king's eyes across the smoke, and found him staring at her now with something far past confusion, something that looked, impossibly, like recognition. "I know you," he rasped.
His voice was wrecked.
Where do I?" "Be still, my king," Halden said, pressing him down. But Garrick fought the hand, his gaze never leaving her. "I have felt you before," he said, and it came out almost like an accusation, almost like a plea. "Long ago. I have felt you before." And Tamsin, with her spine open to the air and her 2nd bone about to come loose, felt the floor of her whole life shift beneath her, because somewhere far back, in a memory she had buried so deep she'd forgotten she owned it, a wounded boy had once gripped her small hand in a healer's hut and refused, for 3 days, to let go. The reforging took until dawn, and Tamsin stayed for every hour of it, because she would not let her own bones leave her sight. She sat on an upturned crate with her back bound and seeping, one leg already gone cold and senseless from the hip down, and watched Etta work the forge with the focus of a woman handling something holy. The bonewright laid the 3 small vertebrae in a cradle of pale fire and pressed the 7 shards of the vow against them, and the metal did not need hammering. It flowed. It poured itself around the living bone the way water pours around a stone, drinking it, braiding with it, and the sound the forge made was not the clang of iron but a low, climbing hum, the same note Tamsin had felt in her own spine when the blade first broke. And she felt every fold of it from the inside.
Not pain.
A rearrangement. As though the hollow places in her back were being mirrored and answered in the metal, as though some part of her was being knit into the blade and was, against all sense, glad to go. By the 4th hour, the vow had a shape. Longer than a dagger, shorter than a sword, curved like a single fang or the edge of a crescent moon, and running through the pale metal were 3 threads of bone that glowed faintly and pulsed. Tamsin pressed her hand to her own chest and felt her heartbeat, and watched the bone light in the blade flare, in perfect time with it. "That shouldn't happen," Etta said softly, staring. "The donor feels the blade. The blade is not supposed to feel the donor back." She turned her white eye on Tamsin, and for the first time in 16 years, the old woman looked at her not with pity, but with something closer to fear. "What are you, girl?" Tamsin had no answer. She only knew that as the sky went gray in the high windows, the king had walked into the forge on his own 2 feet, pale, hollow-eyed, but whole, his fever broken the moment his spirit found its anchor again, and crossed the room, and stopped in front of her. He went down on one knee so his eyes were level with hers. This close, she could count the threads of darker gold in his amber irises, could feel the heat coming off him like a banked fire, could smell pine and smoke and something underneath that was pure animal warning and pure animal welcome, the same message twice over. I am the most dangerous thing you will ever stand near, and I will never let anything touch you again. You gave me 3 bones from your spine, Garrick said quietly, and I do not know your name.
Tamsin, she said. Reeve.
I scrub your steps. Something moved across his ruined face. He reached out, slow, and his fingertips hovered over her chest, over the exact spot where her heartbeat was pulsing in time with a blade on the anvil, and stopped, not quite touching, as if afraid. There is a wolf in you, he murmured, and his voice cracked on it. Right there. I can feel her. She has been there a long time, sleeping. Who told you that you were empty? And Tamsin, who had been told she was empty every single day of her life, opened her mouth to answer him, and found she could not, because the sleeping thing behind her sternum had just opened one eye and turned, slow and vast and impossible, toward him. Chapter 3. They gave the husk a room above the ground for the first time in her life, and Tamsin Reeve lay awake in it, certain it was a trick. It was Garrick's doing, not hers. She would have crawled back to the cold stone behind the healer's hut without complaint, because at least the stone had never pretended to be kind. Instead, the morning after the reforging, 2 warriors who had spat at her feet not a week ago came and carried her up the north stair, carefully, as if she might break, which she might have, and laid her in a bed so soft it frightened her. One of them was a boy named Pell, who had once stuck out his foot and sent her sprawling face first into the mud of the training yard while 40 wolves laughed. Now Pell would not look at her. He set down the water jug with hands that shook, mumbled something about the Luna's rest, and fled down the stair as though the room were full of fire.
Luna. They were already saying it. No one had decided it.
No council had ruled. But a pack believes its blade before it believes its own mouth, and the vow had drunk her bones and glowed the color of her heartbeat, and so the word had begun to move through the fortress on its own, ahead of anyone's permission, and the warriors who had broken her now flinched from her shadow. Tamsin did not know how to hold that. 16 years of being nothing had given her calluses in places where other people kept their pride, and being suddenly something pressed on all of them at once. She turned her face to the window. It was the first window she had ever owned. Through it she could see the white valley falling away beneath the fortress, the pine forest dark against the snow, the gray sky pregnant with more weather. She had spent her whole life underground or on her knees, and now there was a whole world arranged outside her bed, and she did not trust a single inch of it. Her right leg lay dead beneath the blanket, cold from the hip down, the price of the 3rd bone. She tested her toes the way Etta had taught her to. The smallest one answered, sluggish. The next did not. She filed the fact away on the cold shelf in her mind where she kept the rest of the accounting, what was given, what was lost, what remained, and was reaching for it again when the warmth bloomed low in her back. She had no name for it yet. It had started in the forge, and it had not stopped since, a heat that lived in the hollow places where her bones had been, that woke and brightened whenever he drew near. She felt it climb now, rung by rung, as a heavy tread came up the north stair, and by the time the knock landed on her door her heart was already pounding to a rhythm that was not entirely her own. You're awake, Garrick said through the wood. I can feel it. May I? No one had ever asked her permission for anything in her life. Wolfless girls did not own doors to be knocked upon. The simple courtesy of it cracked something open in her chest more cleanly than a command ever could have. It's your fortress, she said. It is not your room. He waited. Only when she said come in did the latch lift. He had to fold his head beneath the lintel to enter, and when he straightened, the chamber seemed to shrink around him, broad and dark and scarred, a mountain of a man wedged into a small bright space he plainly did not fit. The reforged vow hung at his hip, glowing faintly through its sheath, and where its glow touched her, Tamsin felt it as warmth against her spine, as though the blade carried a piece of her body that was still, somehow, attached. The wreckage the broken blade had done to him was healing, but not gone. There was a grayness under his brown skin, and a faint tremor in his great hands as he lowered himself to the edge of her bed, careful, his weight tipping the mattress, so she had to brace against rolling toward him. He smelled of pine and cold air and wood smoke, and underneath it something that was pure animal, a scent that said danger and safety in the same breath, the way a thunderstorm says both. "How is the leg?" he asked. "Mine," she said. "What's left of it?"
His jaw tightened.
"Etta says the feeling may keep slipping. The 3 bones don't grow back." He looked at her, and there was something raw working behind his amber eyes. "You gave them up for a king who never once spoke your name. I have been trying since the forge to understand why a person does that, and I cannot, and it is keeping me from sleep. You needed living bone." She kept her voice flat, the way she kept everything flat because flat was safe. "Mine was the only marrow that rang. There's no riddle in it. The pack needed a thing only I had. It's the first time in my life that was true."
She paused.
"I'd have been a fool to give it away for free. And yet you named no price." "I named the price." She met his eyes. "I told them I'd say what I wanted when I was on the table. And then I lay down, and I looked across that room at you, half dead on your cot, and I realized the only thing I wanted was for you to be in the room when it happened." Her throat worked. "I wanted you to see me. Just once. Before I gave you the part of me that rings." It came out of her before she could stop it, plain and terrible and true, and she hated how naked it left her. 16 years, I scrubbed your steps and you walked over me like I was part of the floor. I wanted one moment where the Alpha King looked at the husk and saw a person. I cut 3 bones out of my spine to buy it. There. That's the whole of it. It's not noble." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Garrick did not speak. He sat very still, and she watched something move across his ruined face. Not pity, which she could have armored against, but something worse, something that looked like grief, as though her words had reached into him and broken a thing he had not known was whole. "Tamsin," he said at last, and her name in his mouth was so careful it ached. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer plainly. Because I have been turning it over since the forge, and I think I have seen you before. Long ago, when I was a boy." The warmth in her spine flared, sharp and sudden, like the blade itself had leaned in to listen. Chapter 4. "When I was 11, Garrick said, my father took me on my first raid, and it went wrong in every way a thing can go wrong." He was not looking at her now. He was looking at his own scarred hands, turning them over in the gray window light as though the memory lived in the calluses. "A rival pack ambushed us in a river gorge. They killed my father's whole guard in the space of a single moonrise. 12 warriors I had known my whole life, men who carried me on their shoulders when I was small, gone before I understood we were losing. A blade opened me here." His fingers brushed his side, low, beneath the ribs, where Tamsin now noticed a long pale seam she had never let herself look at directly. "I should have died in that gorge. My father carried me 3 days through the snow with my own blood freezing in his beard, and on the 3rd night we came to a healer's hut in the eastern reach, far from any pack of standing. A poor place. Mud walls. One fire."
He paused.
"I remember almost none of it. The fever ate it. But there is one thing I have never been able to forget, and I have never told a living soul, because they would have thought the wound had touched my mind." The warmth in Tamsin's spine had gone very still, the way the air goes still before a storm breaks. "There was a hand," he said. "A girl's hand. Small and rough from work, too rough for a child's hand, though I understood that only later. It found mine in the dark when the fever was at its worst, when I was raving and seeing things that were not there, and it held on. For 3 days it held on." His voice dropped. "I told that hand things I have told no one before, or since. I told it I was afraid. I told it I did not want to be king, that I dreamed of a black thing coming through a door in a mountain, that I was certain I would be the king who let the dark through and lost the world. A boy does not say such things aloud, Tamsin. Not a boy who is meant to be Alpha King. But I said them to that hand in the dark, because it was the only thing in the world that did not want me to be brave. He lifted his eyes to hers at last, and they were bright, and they were terrible. And when my father's men came to take me home, healed enough to travel, I screamed. I fought them. I tore the stitches in my side trying to keep hold of that hand, and no one understood why, least of all me. My wolf had imprinted. He was a boy's wolf, half-grown, and he had reached out in the worst hour of my life and chosen, and then they pulled me away before I could so much as see her face. His jaw worked. I have spent 20 years thinking I dreamed her. Every elder I ever asked told me a mate cannot be found by a fevered child, that no record exists of any pack daughter in the Eastern Reach, that I had built her out of pain and wishing. My wolf never believed them. He's been looking for her in every face I've passed for 20 years. His hand rose, slow, and stopped just short of her cheek. And then, in the forge, when Etta cut you, I felt your hand in mine across a room I could not cross. The same hand. I would know it through 100 years. Tamsin. It was you. She could not breathe, because she remembered too. She had buried it so deep that she had taught herself it was a story she'd invented to keep from going mad on the stone floors, a story about a night when, for once, someone had needed her. But now it surfaced whole and unbroken, and there was no pretending it away. The Eastern Reach, she whispered. I was 7. I had no pack and no name, and the old healer kept me to fetch and carry because no one else would. And one night your father came out of the snow with a dying boy, and they put you on the cot by the fire, and everyone said you would not last till dawn. Her eyes had filled, and she did not bother to fight it. I crept in when the healer slept. I wasn't supposed to touch the warrior folk. But you were tossing and crying out, and you were a child like me, and I had never in my whole life been more afraid than the night I crept in to hold the hand of a stranger who was dying, except that you were. You were more afraid than me. You told me about the black thing in the mountain. And I held on because I had never once been the one someone needed, and I did not want it to end, even if it ended with you dying. I think part of me hoped you'd live so that one day, somewhere, someone would remember the husk had been good for something. Garrick made a sound like he had been struck through. It was you, he breathed. 20 years. The mate my wolf chose when I was a boy. The one every elder swore did not exist because they could not find her in any pack of standing. He laughed. Ragged, broken open, helpless. Of course they couldn't. She had no pack. She had no standing. She was a wolfless orphan they would grow up to put behind a healer's hut and beat on stone. His face crumpled and reformed into something fierce. She was scrubbing my steps. For 16 years she was 30 feet beneath my feast hall, and I walked over her, and my wolf was howling for her the whole time, and I called it a dream. He reached out then, and this time he did not stop short. His broad palms settled flat over her sternum, over the spot where the sleeping thing had lived all her life, and Tamsin's breath caught, because the thing behind her ribs, the thing every healer and elder had measured and pronounced dead, the thing the whole pack had spat at her for not having, rose up under his hand. It rose the way an animal rises that has been left out in the cold for 23 years and has finally heard the door open. It pressed back against his palm, warm and vast and impossibly alive. And at his hip, the reforged vow flared bright, its 3 threads of bone-light pulsing in perfect time, with his heart, and with hers, and with the slow opening eye of the wolf that had been waiting inside her since before she could remember. Who? Garrick said, very low, his hand trembling against her chest. Told you that you were empty? Chapter 5. Tamsin did not sleep that night, and for once it was not the wound that kept her from it. She lay in the dark of her too-soft bed with Garrick's questions still ringing in her. Who told you that you were empty, and turned it over the way she had once turned bones over on her workbench, looking for the hairline fracture, the place where the break began. Because there was a break. There had always been a break. She had simply never been allowed to look at it directly. Someone bound your wolf when you were a babe, Etta had said in the war hall, 2 fingers pressed to the hollow of Tamsin's throat. Not to cripple you. To hide you. And then, quieter, almost afraid. Someone in this fortress has spent 23 years making very sure you never found out. Tamsin lay still and counted what she knew, the way she counted vertebrae. She knew her wolf had been bound before she could speak. She knew the binding had been done by someone who understood that a threshold keeper's marrow rings. She knew that someone had then let a wolfless child be beaten on stone for 16 years rather than risk her remembering what she was. And she knew one thing more, a thing no one in that war hall had said aloud, because none of them shared her habit of counting. The threshold had held for 9 generations. Wards do not simply fail of their own weight. The dark moon had come every 23 years for 200 years, and the seal had never once slipped. Someone had broken the vow. The hollow was not coming on its own. Someone had reached into the heart of the pack and shattered the one blade that kept the door of the world shut. And then, when the only living bone that could mend it turned out to be the very girl they'd spent 2 decades hiding, that someone had been forced to sit in a war hall and watch their secret climb into the Luna's chair. She thought of the hooded figure standing silent among the elders. She thought of the look that had passed between him and Solveig. Quick, sidelong. The look of 2 people who already knew each other's business. And she got up. It cost her. The dead leg dragged, and the wound in her spine pulled with every step, and she had to brace herself against the cold wall of the stair the whole way down. But there was one place in the whole fortress that had ever told her the truth without first deciding whether she deserved it, and that was the Undercroft, the bone vault beneath the great hall, where the pack's dead were catalogued and the old records slept in their cracked leather skins. She had spent 4 years down there in the dark with the dead, and she knew every shelf by touch. She knew, too, that bone rights kept ledgers going back generations, longer than any king's memory, and that bone rights of all people wrote down the things that kings preferred to forget. A scribe who handles the dead learns early that the dead do not care, who is shamed by the truth. The Undercroft was exactly as she had left it. Bone dust on every surface, the close mineral cold, the faint sweet undertone of marrow that she had long since stopped smelling. Her single candle threw the shelves into tall moving shadows. She went straight to the oldest section, the volumes the previous bone rights had left, the ones whose spines had gone soft as cloth, and she began to read. She read for hours. Her eyes burned. Her back throbbed in its 3 points of absence. She moved backward through the generations, through cramped hands and faded inks, through catalogues of the dead so old the names meant nothing to anyone living. And just before dawn, in a volume so ancient its pages had gone the color of weak tea, she found it. The hand here was different from the rest, fast, furious, pressed so hard into the page that the quill had torn it in places, as though the writer had known they were running out of time. "I set this down though it costs me," the long-dead Bonewright had written. "The last scribe, who knew it had his tongue taken. But the dead deserve a truthful keeper, and so will I be." The keeper line did not end in honest war, as the kings tell it. The threshold keepers were murdered. Poisoned at a wedding feast, the very feast where the king had sworn to wed their daughter and join his blood to theirs. He did not want the marriage. He wanted the song. So he killed the singers and kept the music, and forged their bones into the first Fang blade, and told the world the keepers had died of a fever and willed their gift to the crown. But one child lived. A daughter, an infant, smuggled out of the feast hall in a servant's arms while the poison did its work. The servant could not outrun a king's hunters with a child whose marrow rang like a struck bell, so she bound the babe's wolf with the keeper's own deep magic, that no hunter might scent the song in her, and she hid the child among the packless and the nameless, where no one of standing would ever think to look. The line lives. It hides. The wolves believe they own the song, but a song does not die because its singers are murdered. It only sleeps. It passes, mother to daughter, dark and quiet, down the long years. And one night, when the seal fails and the dark comes and no wolf alive can sing the threshold shut, the old blood will surface. And the kings will learn at last the price of what they bartered away. The candle guttered. Tamsin's hands were shaking so badly the page trembled in them. One child lived. An infant. Her wolf bound. Hidden among the packless and the nameless. Hidden among the husks. Hidden behind a healer's hut. Hidden under stone floors with a scrub brush in her hands, where no one of standing would ever think to look. It had always been her. Not chosen, not lucky, not bewitched. Inherited. The last drop of a bloodline the wolves had drunk and tried to wash away. The blade had not stumbled onto her bones by chance in that forge. It had gone looking for its own blood, across 9 generations and 200 years, and it had found her in the cellar scrubbing the floors they made her scrub. "You found it," said a voice behind her. "Faster than I had hoped, and slower than I had feared." Tamsin's whole body went cold. She turned, the dead leg nearly buckling under her, and lifted the guttering candle toward the foot of the undercroft stair. A figure stood there, hood thrown back now, and the dying light fell across a face she knew, a face she had bowed to 100 times without ever once being seen in return. Amber eyes, the same gold as Garrick's, but cold, the warm metal of them gone to old, dull brass. Chapter 6. Elder Bran, Tamsin said. The name came out steady, which surprised her, because nothing else about her was. Garrick's own uncle, the eldest of the elders. The man who had ruled as regent through the king's boyhood, who sat at the head of every council, whose word the warriors took as law second only to the Alpha's own. She had bowed to him 100 times with a scrub brush in her hand. He had never once looked down. He was looking now. "I bound you myself," Bran said, and his voice was almost gentle, almost kind, which was the most frightening thing she had ever heard. He came down the last of the stair, slow, unhurried, the way a man walks toward a thing he has already decided is finished. "In that healer's hut in the Eastern Reach, when you were a babe still red from the birthing. I had hunted your bloodline for 40 years, child. 40 years, tracing one thread of old blood through pack after pack, feast after feast, ending the line a drop at a time. By the night I found you, you were the last, the very last keeper left alive in all the territories." His mouth thinned. "I had the knife at your throat. I was a single breath from finishing what my fathers began." "Then why didn't you?" Her own voice scraped out of her. "Why am I alive? My fool of a nephew." Bran's lip curled. Garrick, half dead with fever on the next cot, took your little hand in his and would not let go. "I watched it happen. I watched his wolf, a boy's wolf, barely formed, reach across that dark hut and imprint on you. Choose you. And I understood, in that one moment, that if I cut your throat, I would break the boy I was raising to be Alpha King. He would have carried the wound of a severed bond his whole life. He would have been a hollow thing on the throne." He spread his hands, almost regretful. "I could not afford a broken king. So I did the next best thing. I left the binding on your wolf, and I let the husk live. Wolfless, worthless, nameless. I was certain no soul alive would ever look twice at a packless orphan scrubbing floors behind a healer's hut." His brass eyes glittered. 23 years it held. 23 years. You were the safest secret in the world. Buried in plain sight, beaten down so far that not even you believed there was anything inside you worth hiding. Tamsin's whole life rearranged itself around his words, the way a skeleton reassembles when you finally find the missing bone. The moon ceremony, the boots, the spat-on feet, the stone floor, and the empty years. Every cruelty she had survived had not been random misfortune. It had been cover. The pack had broken her so thoroughly that the breaking itself became her disguise. "You broke the vow," she said. "I broke the vow." He said it without shame, almost with pride. Garrick is a sentimental king. Soft. He keeps old alliances out of loyalty and refuses the wars that would make this pack the greatest in the North. I have watched the Greymoor's strength bleed away under him for years. So yes, I shattered his father's blade. I let the seal on the threshold fail. When the dark moon comes and the hollow walks through that door, it will gut this pack down to the marrow, and then I will rise from the ruin with the old knowledge of how to bind the dark again, and I will forge what remains into something strong. A pack ruled by fear instead of fondness. The pack we were always meant to be. His face soured. It was perfect. It was flawless. And then the blade needed living bone to mend, and the only marrow in all the territories that could mend it turned out to be yours. The one thing I had hidden. The one secret I had spent 23 years burying. The blade went looking for its own blood, and it found you in the cellar. He drew a thin, pale knife from inside his sleeve. I waited too long. The bond between you and the boy has already rooted. I felt it take in the war hall. I cannot cut it cleanly now. But a threshold keeper with 3 bones already sawn from her spine is a fragile, fragile thing, child. One more wound here. His eyes dropped to the seeping gap in her back, in exactly the right place, and the song dies with you. The blade goes silent. And the hollow comes through clean, and no one will ever know there was a queen in the cellar at all. He moved fast for an old wolf, faster than a man his age had any right to, the knife driving straight for the hollow in her spine. But Tamsin had spent her whole life learning bones. 16 years of cataloging the dead, of feeling exactly where a body is strong and where it is weak, of knowing the precise place beneath the jaw where the great vessel runs close to the skin. She did not have a wolf's speed. She had something the wolves had never bothered to fear. She knew anatomy. And as the pale knife came down, she was already twisting on her dead leg, already driving the burning candlestick up and under his guard into the soft place beneath his jaw. It struck true. Bran staggered, choking, his own blade going wide and scoring a hot line across her shoulder instead of her spine. Tamsin ran. She dragged her dead leg up the undercroft stair, hauling herself hand over hand along the cold wall, and she did the one thing she had never in her life been allowed to do. She screamed. She screamed for help, openly, loudly, like a person who believed help might come, and the name that tore out of her was not a cry for mercy or a plea to the moon. It was the one name her whole body now knew like a second heartbeat, the warmth that lived in the hollow of her spine, the thread that ran bone to blade to king. Garrick. Behind her, Bran roared and lunged, his hand fisting in her hair, dragging her back down toward the dark, and his pale knife laid cold against the wound on her spine, the killing place, the song's resting place. And then something inside Tamsin Reeve, something that had slept for 23 years under stone and scorn and binding magic, moved. It was not fear that woke it. It was fury. The clean, white, 23-year fury of a girl who had been told every single day that she was empty, hearing at last from the mouth of the man who'd emptied her exactly how the lie had been built. The thing behind her sternum, the dead wolf, the absent wolf, the wolf the whole pack had spat on her for lacking, opened one vast silver eye in the dark. And the binding, 23 years old, began to crack. Chapter 7. Garrick came through the undercroft door, like the wall itself had decided to walk. Tamsin felt him before she saw him, the warmth in her spine flaring white-hot as his tread hit the top of the stair, and then the heavy door burst inward off its hinges, and the Alpha King filled the frame, and the look on his face was the last thing in the world she would ever have wanted turned toward her. She had time to see the others behind him. Halden, the beta, his sword already drawn. Etta, leaning hard on her stick, both eyes wide. A dozen warriors crowding the landing with weapons half-raised and faces frozen in a horror that had nothing to do with the hollow. Because here, in the bone dark beneath their feast hall, was the regent who had raised their king, the elder they had all bowed to their whole lives, with a knife to the throat of the king's fated mate. "Uncle," Garrick said. The word dropped into the stairwell so quietly that the whole space seemed to hold its breath around it. "Stay back, boy." For the first time, Bran's voice cracked. His fist was still knotted in Tamsin's hair, the pale knife still cold against the wound in her spine, and she could feel the old wolf's hand beginning to shake. "You don't understand what she is. You never could. This girl is the rot in the foundation of everything you stand on, her blood, her song, the whole murdered line of them. Let me end it, and I will make this pack strong. Strong enough that no hollow, no rival king, no enemy in all the North will ever." "You broke the vow." Garrick did not shout it. He did not need to. His amber eyes had gone past anger into something flat and final, and the warriors behind him went still as stone. "You broke my father's blade," the king went on, each word laid down like a paving stone. You let the seal on the threshold fail. You would have fed 200 of my people to the dark and called it strength. His gaze flicked to Tamsin, and for one instant the terrible flatness cracked and something agonized showed through it. And you bound her. You bound my maid in her cradle, and you hid her under my own floors. You let them beat her on stone for 16 years, when she was mine, when my wolf had been screaming for her since I was a boy, when you knew. For the pack, Bran spat. She is the pack. And then everything happened at once. Bran's hand jerked, and the pale knife bit down into the open wound on Tamsin's spine, a white spear of agony that arched her whole body against him. And at the king's hip the reforged vow blazed like a second sun, because Tamsin's bone was in that blade, and the blade felt her pain as its own, and screamed it back through the bond. And the thread between her and Garrick, spine to blade to king, pulled so violently taut that for one impossible instant she felt his wolf come through it. Felt his fury flood the hollow places in her back. Felt 20 years of looking and 1 moment of finding pour into her like fire poured into a mold. And the binding broke. 23 years of suppression, magic laid on her in a healer's hut before she could speak a word, shattered all at once, like river ice splitting in the first hour of spring. The thing behind her sternum that the whole pack had called empty uncoiled, and it was not empty. It had never been empty. It was vast and old and silver, and it filled every bone in her body at once, even the 3 that were gone, flooding the gaps in her spine with something that was not quite bone and not quite light. Her wound sealed over between one heartbeat and the next. Her dead leg woke, sensation crashing down it like a wave breaking. Her eyes blazed pale silver, bright enough that the warriors on the landing flinched and looked away. And from her open mouth came a sound that no wolf in that fortress had ever heard. Not a howl, a note, a single clear ringing tone that was the whole of the Threshold Keeper's song compressed into one breath, the song the first vow had been forged to carry, the song 9 generations of kings had murdered to possess and never once been able to sing themselves. It rolled out of her and through the stone, and the bone dust on every shelf lifted and shimmered, and the dead in their catalogues seemed to lean in to listen, and the whole fortress rang. Bran screamed. He fell back from her, the pale knife clattering to the flagstones, both his hands clapped over his ears with blood running bright between the fingers. The song was anathema to what he was. It found the murder in his bloodline, and it answered the murder with light. And Garrick crossed the Undercroft in 2 strides. He caught his uncle by the throat and lifted him, lifted the old wolf clean off his feet as though he weighed no more than the bones on the shelves, and pinned him to the cold stone wall, and held him there. And he looked at the man who had raised him for one long, terrible moment, and his eyes were no longer amber. They had gone pure white, the rarest color a wolf's eyes can take, the color they turn before something that outranks even an alpha king, a biological surrender so seldom seen that most wolves live their whole lives without witnessing it once. The whole pack on the landing saw their king's eyes go white in the presence of the husk who had scrubbed his floors, and they understood, all at once and forever, exactly what they had been spitting on. "You had a queen in my cellar," Garrick said softly, to the choking old wolf in his grip, "and you taught her to call herself empty." For a moment Tamsin thought he would kill him. She saw the wolf rise in him, saw the white eyes narrow, saw the great hand tighten. And she found she did not know what she wanted, whether she wanted Bran dead at last, or whether she wanted him alive to see exactly how completely he had failed. It was Garrick who chose. Slowly, with an effort she felt through the bond, he uncurled his fingers and let Bran drop to his knees, gasping on the stone. "No," the king said. "You do not get the mercy of my hand. You will face the judgment of the whole pack, in the great hall, in the light, and you will look at her while they decide, and you will know that the line you spent 40 years trying to end is going to sit on the throne you tried to steal." He turned to his warriors.
"Take him.
Bind him. He answers for it at the rising of the moon." They took Bran. And Garrick turned to Tamsin, silver-eyed, whole-spined, her dead leg alive beneath her and the keeper's song still humming low in her bones, and crossed the floor to her, and went down on one knee on the cold stone, in front of his entire gathered pack, and bowed his dark head to the girl they had called a husk. "My Luna," he said. And outside, far above them, the last sliver of the moon slid behind the mountain, and the dark moon began. Chapter 8. The dark moon brought the hollow, and it came not through the gate, but through the floor of the world. They felt it before they saw it. A wrongness, a pressure, the air itself going thick and cold as old grease. Up in the great hall, where the whole pack had gathered for Bran's judgment, the torches guttered low and burned blue at their tips, and a sound began beneath the stone, a vast, dry, grinding sound, like a tomb door that had been shut for 200 years deciding at last to open. The threshold. Etta breathed. The seals failed. It's coming through. It came through the deep place beneath the fortress, the buried door in the mountain's heart that 9 generations of kings had kept shut with a song they could not sing and a blade forged from a bloodline they had murdered. With a vow broken for so many days, the seal had worn paper thin, and now, in the dark of the moon, it tore. The hollow poured up through the undercroft like black water, finding a crack. It had no true shape. It was the absence of shape, a churning dark that swallowed torchlight and made the eyes ache to look at it, threaded through with too many pale, reaching limbs. Where it touched stone, the stone went gray and dead. Where it touched a warrior who stood too slow to flee, the warrior simply stopped, fell where he stood, eyes open, emptied of whatever it is that makes a body a person. It rolled into the great hall, and the pack broke before it. 200 wolves who had never in their lives met a thing their teeth could not answer.
To me.
Garrick's voice cracked across the chaos like a whip. He stood on the dais, the reforged vow drawn and blazing in his fist, its 3 threads of bone light flaring bright against the dark, and the pack rallied to that light because it was the only light left in the hall. Hold the line. Buy her the time she needs. Her. They all knew who he meant. Every eye that could tear itself from the dark turned to the silver-eyed girl beside the throne. Tamsin felt the hollow the way she felt everything now, in her bones. And what she felt was not only horror. It was recognition. The dark thing churning toward her carried a frequency she knew, a deep dead note, and woven all through it was the answer note her own marrow had rung with her whole life without her understanding why. The song was not a weapon you swung at the hollow. The song was a key. The keepers had never killed the dark. They had only ever sung the door shut. And the door could not be sung shut from the hall. It had to be sung shut from the threshold itself. "I have to go down," she said. Garrick's white blazing eyes found her across the breaking hall. "Then we go down together." There was no time to argue, and she did not want to. She took his free hand, and he carved them a path through the dark with a vow, the only blade in the world that could touch the hollow, the bone light shearing through the reaching limbs and the churning black where ordinary steel passed straight through and did nothing. Step by step they fought down the undercroft stair, into the cold and the bone dust, toward the deep place where the seal had torn, and the hollow boiled up around them, and Tamsin began, low in her chest, to sing. It was not a song with words. It was the note she had rung with all her life. She let it out, and it climbed, and the bone dust on the shelves rose shimmering into the air, and the dead in their catalogues lent it weight, and where the song touched the hollow, the dark recoiled. But one voice was not enough. She felt it almost at once. The threshold was vast and old, and the tear in it was wide, and she was one girl with 3 bones gone from her spine, and the song was draining her faster than she could feed it. Her knees began to buckle. The silver in her eyes guttered. The dark surged back into the gaps where her voice thinned, reaching for her, for the song, to swallow the last keeper and the music both at once. Tamsin. Garrick's hand closed over hers, and over the vow. "The blade," she gasped. "Your hand and mine. On the blade. Together." He understood before she finished. He turned the vow hilt toward her, and she wrapped both her hands around the bare blade itself, and it did not cut her, because the bone in the metal was her bone, and the edge knew its own blood and sealed against her palms like 2 surfaces made to meet. Garrick's hands closed over hers, over the hilt and the bone light both, and the circuit snapped shut. Her bone, the blade spirit, the king's wolf, the king's whole bonded line of 9 murdered and married kings, and beneath them all, older than any of it, the keeper's song. She sang again. And this time she was not one voice. The vow sang with her.
The bone in it sang.
And through it, impossibly, every king whose spirit slept in that ancient metal lent their strength to the song their fathers had stolen, and Garrick, his hands over hers, his wolf flooding through the bond, sang too, a low wolf-throated undernote beneath her clear high tone. The marriage the first king had murdered to avoid, blade and song, wolf and keeper, finally, 200 years too late, happened here in the dark, with their 4 hands on one blade. The note that rose out of the two of them was not a sound the stone could hold. It rolled out and down into the torn threshold, and the dark stopped. The reaching limbs froze. The churning black drew back into itself, sucked toward the buried door in the mountain's heart, and the door, the great seal that had stood 9 generations, closed. Stone flowed back into stone. The tear knit shut. The dead note of the hollow thinned to nothing and was gone, swallowed back behind a door that no king had sealed in 200 years and that 2 bound mates had just sealed in a single breath. The silence after was enormous. Tamsin sagged, and Garrick caught her, the vow falling forgotten to the stone between them, its bone light dimming gently now to a soft, steady glow that pulsed in time with 2 hearts that had become, somewhere in the song, a single beat. He pressed his forehead to hers. His breath came ragged. Above them, through the stone, they could hear the great hall, could hear the dark draining out of it, could hear 200 wolves who had been losing realize, all at once, that they had somehow won. "Mate," Garrick said, low and wrecked, his white eyes fading back to amber. "My Luna, my keeper, mine." "Yours," she said. And it was the truest word she had ever spoken. He bent his head to the place where her neck met her shoulder, and she tipped her head and bared it to him. Submission and trust and invitation, all the things the wolf tongue meant by it, and all the things her own heart meant beneath them. She felt his teeth, sharp and precise. And then the bite. It did not hurt the way the saw had hurt. It was heat. It spread from the mark out through her blood and her bones and the gaps where her 3 vertebrae had been, filling them not with phantom song this time, but with something solid and warm and permanent. The bond sealed over like a wound healing clean. And the keeper's song, which had rung alone in her marrow for 23 lonely years, finally had a wolf note beating beneath it forever. When he lifted his mouth, a silver-pink crescent shone at the curve of her throat. His wolf was visible just behind his eyes, vast and old, and, for the first time in 20 years, content. "You were never empty," he murmured against her skin. "You were just the only door the dark could never open. And I was the only one who ever held your hand long enough to find that out." Above them, the pack began to howl, and it was not a battle cry. It was the long, rising, joyful sound of 200 wolves welcoming a Luna home. And there it is, my loves, the wolfless husk who turned out to be the last queen of a murdered line, the king who never stopped looking for the hand that held his, and the dark moon they sang shut together. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for listening all the way to the end. If Tamsin's story moved you, if you ever felt empty and found out you were never empty at all, do me one small favor before you go. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I read every single one, and I love picturing all of you out there. Stay warm, stay wild, and I'll see you under the next moon.